When Rachel and Aaron moved into their new house, they were full of excitement and hope. It was their first home together, nestled in a quiet, suburban neighborhood that promised peace and a fresh start. The house, though old, had a certain charm. Its original wooden floors creaked with history, and the walls, despite being worn down by time, had a welcoming warmth. The couple was eager to make it their own, to strip away the remnants of past lives and breathe new life into the space. The house was a fixer-upper, a project that would require patience and attention. They spent weeks planning, poring over design magazines, and debating which rooms would get the most attention. There was one room in particular that caught their attention, the study. It was a small room tucked away behind the kitchen, with walls that seemed slightly out of place. There was something off about it, a sense of dissonance, like the room had never fully belonged. One afternoon, as they prepared to begin renovations, Aaron knocked into the wall by accident. There was an odd hollow sound. He paused, frowning, and then tapped the wall again more deliberately. A strange vibration reverberated back at him, as though there was something behind it. "Hey Rachel, come here," he called, his curiosity piqued. Rachel walked over, and they both tapped along the surface, trying to pinpoint what lay beyond. There was a space behind the wall, a small, concealed compartment that neither of them had noticed before. Rachel's hand trembled as she reached for a crowbar, and with a little effort, she pried loose the drywall. What they found on the other side was not what they expected. There was a narrow, hidden room, no larger than a small closet, and inside were remnants of something unsettling, old, crumpled newspapers, a few broken pieces of furniture, and a yellowing, faded mirror that looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. But the most disturbing part was the smell. It was a musty, dank scent, something that clung to the air and made Rachel's throat tighten. It was as though the room had been sealed off for a reason that wasn't immediately apparent. Aaron stepped into the cramped space, brushing away cobwebs and dust as he scanned the room. On the floor near the far wall was a small box no bigger than a shoebox. His fingers lingered on the lid, a strange sense of unease creeping up his spine. He hesitated for only a moment before opening it. Inside the box were photographs, faded and old, each one depicting different people standing in front of the house. The first photo was of a family, a mother, father, and 2 children, all standing outside the front door. They were smiling, happy, in front of the same house they now owned. But the longer Aaron looked at the picture, the more wrong it felt. There was something off about their smiles, too forced, too wide, as though they were hiding something. Then Rachel gasped. She leaned over his shoulder, her eyes widening as she examined the next photograph. It was an image of the same house, but it was taken many years later. The once pristine lawn was overgrown, and the windows appeared cracked, with sheets of dark fabric draped over them like an eerie curtain. But the most disturbing thing in the photo was the figure standing in the doorway, a shadowy, indistinct shape that seemed to blur and twist in the light. The shape seemed wrong. "Who are these people?" Rachel whispered, her voice barely audible. Aaron didn't answer immediately. He was too transfixed by the photographs, his fingers brushing over the edges of the faded paper, as though searching for something that wasn't there. There were more pictures, each one more disturbing than the last. There were photos of the same family members, but in each one, their expressions grew colder and more distant, as though they were slowly losing touch with reality. Some of the images seemed to show the children alone, standing in the backyard, their faces obscured by shadows. Aaron looked around the room, his stomach tightening. There was something deeply wrong about this hidden space. The smell of decay seemed to grow stronger, and he felt a chill crawl up his spine. But he couldn't stop himself from looking closer. His eyes scanned the walls, where faint symbols were scratched into the wood. They were crude and unsettling, etched into the surface with something sharp. They looked like they had been carved by hand, though the marks were too uneven to be intentional. Suddenly, Rachel cried out, her hand flying to her mouth. Her eyes were wide with horror as she pointed to something on the far wall. There, etched into the wood, was a message. The words were barely legible, but Aaron could make out the phrase. "Don't open the door." It was a warning, left behind by someone who had known. But knew what? And why? Rachel stumbled back, her breath quickening, her pulse racing. She wanted to leave, to close the door and forget about the hidden room. But something in the back of her mind told her to press on. There was something they were meant to find here, something they needed to understand. She wasn't sure why, but she felt it deep inside. Aaron, however, was already moving. He began to look around the rest of the room, rifling through the old furniture. A small desk sat in the corner, its drawer slightly ajar. He pulled it open, revealing a collection of old, yellowed letters, some written in ink, others in pencil. The handwriting was frantic, disjointed, but it was the last letter, scrawled hastily across a torn piece of paper, that sent a cold shiver down his spine. "They're still here. We should have never moved in. The house isn't empty. It's waiting for us. It wants us." The words were barely coherent, but Aaron understood their meaning. The house had been waiting, and now it was waiting for them. As Rachel stood frozen, staring at the letter in Aaron's hand, the atmosphere in the room seemed to shift. The air felt colder, heavier, as though it was pressing in on them from all sides. The distant hum of the city outside no longer seemed comforting. Instead, it felt distant, irrelevant, like they were sealed off from the world. Rachel's eyes darted back to the photographs. The family in the pictures, their forced smiles, their increasingly unsettling expressions, began to haunt her thoughts. She could hear the echoes of their laughter, distorted and warped, lingering in the air. The thought of those faces watching them, trapped in time, filled her with a deep sense of dread. "We need to get out of here, Aaron," Rachel said, her voice strained. She reached out, grasping his arm. "This place, it's not right. We should have never touched this room." Aaron, however, didn't seem to hear her. His attention was fixed on the last photograph he had pulled from the box, the one with the shadowy figure standing in the doorway. He couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching him, its dark presence looming over him, just beyond his peripheral vision. The longer he stared at the photo, the more real the figure seemed to become. It felt like it was moving, shifting, as if it were alive. His heart began to race. "What's wrong with me?" Aaron muttered, rubbing his eyes. "I keep seeing that thing like it's right here." Rachel could feel the creeping sense of unease worming its way into her mind. She could sense the weight of the house, its presence, bearing down on her. It was as if the walls were closing in, trapping them in some kind of unseen snare. She grabbed Aaron's hand and pulled him towards the doorway, but as she reached out for the doorframe, something stopped her. A low, rasping noise echoed through the room, a faint scratching sound that seemed to come from within the walls. Aaron's breath caught in his throat. He turned, his eyes wide, but there was nothing there. Just the silent, oppressive atmosphere. Yet the noise continued, growing louder, more frantic, as if something was moving inside the walls, something desperate to get out. "What is that?" Rachel whispered, her voice trembling. "What's happening?" Before Aaron could answer, the lights flickered once, then twice. The low hum of the building's electricity buzzed, but the lights failed to stay on. The room was plunged into darkness, the only sounds the rapid breathing of both of them and the gnawing, scraping noise from within the walls. Suddenly, there was a loud thud, like something heavy had been dropped. It echoed from above them, reverberating down the hall and through the walls. Rachel gasped, instinctively clutching Aaron's arm tighter. "Did you hear that?" Aaron's voice was tight. "Yes. I don't know what it was. But we have to get out of here now." As they turned to leave the room, the door slammed shut with a violent bang. The noise was deafening, making them both jump back in shock. Rachel's heart raced as she rattled the handle, but the door wouldn't budge. "We're trapped," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, terror creeping into her tone. "We need to get out. Please, we need to leave." Aaron yanked on the door again, but it was no use. The door was locked somehow. He backed away, stumbling into the room, panic creeping in. "We need to find another way out." "The window." He didn't finish his sentence. A chill filled the room, freezing the air in their lungs. From the corner of the room, near the far wall, something stirred. It was subtle at first, a dark shape, barely visible in the dim light. But it was moving, crawling toward them, its presence becoming more tangible with every passing second. It was almost as if the darkness itself had taken on form, slithering toward them in long, fluid motions. Rachel's breath caught in her throat. "Aaron, what is that?" Aaron could barely comprehend what he was seeing. A figure, indistinct and shadowy, crawled out from the dark corner. Its shape twisted unnaturally, as though its limbs weren't meant to move that way. It was tall, its form hunched, and as it came closer, they could make out faint features, too distorted, too blurred to be human. Its eyes, if they could even be called eyes, were hollow, voids of darkness that seemed to pierce through them. The room grew colder, the air thick with a palpable sense of dread. "Move," Aaron managed to say through gritted teeth. "Now!" Without thinking, they both lunged for the window, but as they tried to pull it open, the entire frame began to rattle violently. It was as if something was pushing against the other side, trying to keep them inside. The air around them became suffocating, and the figure in the corner slowly rose to its full height, towering over them like a nightmare brought to life. Rachel's heart pounded in her chest. She wanted to scream, but no sound came out. She was paralyzed by the thing before them, its presence overwhelming. It reached out with long, spindly fingers that seemed to stretch, elongating beyond what was natural, and touched the window pane. The glass cracked under its touch, splintering into 1,000 tiny shards. "Run!" Aaron shouted, and for the first time, Rachel was able to move. She grabbed his hand, and they bolted for the door, desperate to escape the claustrophobic space. But as they reached the doorway, the scratching noise from the walls escalated into a deafening screech, and the figure lunged at them. Rachel and Aaron didn't know what was real anymore. All they knew was that they had to survive. They stumbled through the dark hallway, their hearts hammering in their chests. Every step felt like an eternity, as if the very air was thickening around them, dragging them down. The building groaned as if it were alive, each creak and groan of the floorboards under their feet sending jolts of panic through their veins. "Where do we go?" Rachel gasped, looking frantically around. The hallway seemed to stretch endlessly, doors on both sides standing like silent sentinels, their interiors shrouded in darkness. Aaron's mind raced. There had to be a way out, some escape from whatever had been awakened in that room. But the hallway felt like a maze, every turn leading to more uncertainty, more fear. "We need to get downstairs," he said finally, his voice rough with urgency. "The building's power must have gone out, but we might be able to get to the main entrance. We'll break the window, or—" Before he could finish, the noise returned. That awful, scrabbling, scratching noise echoed through the walls, growing louder and more frenzied. It was as if something was chasing them, crawling through the very bones of the building, closing in on them. The sound was disorienting, coming from all directions. No matter where they turned, it seemed to follow, getting closer with every passing second. Rachel clutched Aaron's arm tighter, her fingers digging into his skin. "It's right behind us," she whispered, her breath ragged with fear. She didn't need to look back to know it. She could feel it, that malevolent presence closing in. "Keep moving," Aaron urged, trying to push forward, but his legs felt heavy, like the very floor beneath them was pulling him down. The air grew thick, suffocating, and his thoughts were clouded with fear. He could see it in Rachel's face, the same terror, the same feeling of being hunted. There was no safe place, no refuge. It was as if the building itself had become a living thing, trapping them in its grasp. They reached a stairwell door, and Aaron pulled it open, desperate to escape to the building's main floors. But as he stepped inside, the door slammed shut behind them with a violent force. They turned, trying to push it open again, but it was locked from the outside. They were trapped in the stairwell, the walls around them closing in, the feeling of being watched becoming unbearable. "Why won't this door open?" Rachel's voice cracked. "We're going to die here, aren't we?" Aaron's eyes darted around, his mind spinning. The scratching noise was now accompanied by something else, a low, guttural growl that seemed to reverberate through the air, deep and primal. It sounded too close, too real. "I don't know, but we can't give up. We'll figure something out," he said, though his voice lacked the conviction it had once held. The stairwell seemed to stretch impossibly long, the steps descending into darkness below. Their footsteps echoed in the silence, loud and jarring, breaking the eerie quiet. Suddenly, the growl grew louder, and then came a sound that made Rachel freeze, a tapping, like nails on the stone steps, slow and deliberate. "It's coming," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "We're not alone anymore." Aaron turned, but there was nothing behind them, only the black void of the stairwell. Yet the tapping continued, now joined by a dragging sound, like something heavy scraping against the steps. It was getting closer. "Move, move, move," Aaron shouted, his grip on Rachel tightening. They pushed forward, running as fast as they could, their legs burning from the effort. The stairwell seemed to never end, but still they ran, knowing they had no choice but to escape. Then a loud crash echoed through the stairwell, a violent, bone-jarring sound. Something, or someone, had just fallen, and it wasn't far behind them. Rachel's breath caught in her throat. "Aaron, it's here. It's right behind us." Without another word, they ran harder, the sound of something pursuing them growing louder with every step. Their heartbeats were deafening in their ears, and the world around them blurred into a haze of fear and desperation. Finally, they reached the bottom of the stairwell. The door to the building's main lobby was in sight, but it was locked. Aaron slammed his shoulder into it, but it didn't budge. Behind them, the growl grew louder, more vicious. The walls trembled, and the sound of scraping intensified, shaking the very foundation of the building. "We're not going to make it," Rachel whispered, her voice barely audible as she collapsed to her knees. She was too tired, too terrified to keep going. Aaron, however, refused to give up. He yanked on the door again, his desperation turning to fury. "Open, damn it! We need to get out!" With a final heave, the door gave way. It crashed open, and they spilled into the dimly lit lobby. But before they could take another step, the door slammed shut behind them, and they heard it, a voice. A whisper, soft and rasping, like it was coming from the walls themselves. "You can't leave." The words seemed to come from every direction, echoing around them. Aaron and Rachel turned, but there was no one there, only the empty, oppressive space of the lobby. Rachel's heart skipped a beat. "What the hell was that?" she gasped. Aaron didn't answer. He was too focused on the darkness closing in. From the shadows, a figure emerged, its outline blurry, like a wisp of smoke, moving unnaturally fast. It was the same figure they had seen before, dark, shapeless, and full of malice. It took a step forward, and the floor beneath them seemed to tremble. The air grew cold, suffocating. Aaron and Rachel backed away, but there was nowhere to run. The lobby seemed to stretch and warp, the walls closing in on them like the jaws of a trap. "We're not getting out," Rachel said, her voice a whisper of terror. "It's too late." Aaron didn't respond. He was staring at the shadowy figure, his mind spinning. There was no escape, no way to outrun it. And then, with one final, terrifying step, the figure lunged at them, and everything went black. The last thing Aaron felt before everything went silent was the cold touch of something against his skin. Cold, dark, and unmistakably alive. Darkness swallowed them whole, and time seemed to stretch into infinity. It was as if the air had become thick and heavy, weighing down on their every breath, making movement impossible. Aaron's mind raced, still grappling with the terrifying finality of their situation. His heart pounded in his chest, as if it were fighting against the very blood that flowed through his veins. But then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, something shifted. There was no sound, no movement, just an overwhelming sense of presence. They were not alone, but they hadn't been alone from the moment they stepped foot into this cursed building. The walls, the floors, the very air seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy, as if the building itself was alive, and something was watching them. Aaron blinked rapidly, his eyes adjusting to the faint light that had suddenly returned. He could feel the floor beneath him, solid and cold, though his limbs felt heavy, as though weighed down by an invisible force. His head throbbed with pain, and when he reached out to touch his forehead, his fingers came away wet with blood. "Rachel," he whispered hoarsely, forcing himself to sit up. His voice trembled in the suffocating stillness, barely rising above a breath. "Rachel, are you?" But there was no answer. The silence around him seemed to grow deeper, more oppressive. He scrambled to his feet, desperately searching the darkness, but Rachel was nowhere to be seen. Panic clawed at him, and his breath quickened. She had been right next to him just moments ago. She couldn't have gone far. "Rachel!" Aaron shouted, his voice cracking with desperation. "Rachel, please!" His words echoed through the space, bouncing off the walls in a maddeningly disjointed rhythm. His pulse quickened as his mind raced with terrifying possibilities. Had she vanished? Or worse, had she fallen victim to whatever dark force had haunted this place? Suddenly the air shifted. There was a sound, a faint scraping, like nails on stone, coming from the far end of the room. Aaron's heart skipped a beat as he turned toward the noise, every fiber of his being screaming at him to run, to flee. But he couldn't, not without Rachel, not until he knew what had happened to her. With great effort, Aaron staggered toward the sound, his steps unsteady and uneven, his limbs stiff. The scraping grew louder, closer. The air felt colder, as though the temperature had dropped by several degrees in mere moments. And then, through the darkness, Aaron saw it. A figure, hunched over in the shadows, moving slowly, methodically, as if it were savoring each step. A figure that should not have been there, its shape indistinct, its features impossible to make out. All Aaron could see were its eyes, two glowing orbs that seemed to burn with an inner malevolent light. They were locked onto him, unblinking and cold. He froze. The thing moved again, its limbs creaking with an unnatural sound, like broken bones scraping against stone. It was coming closer, its presence growing more oppressive with every step. Aaron's mind raced, his thoughts scrambling to find a way out, but all he could do was stare at those glowing eyes, transfixed. Suddenly, a voice echoed in his mind, a whisper, soft and sickly sweet, like honey dripping from a wound. "You shouldn't have come here." Aaron's breath caught in his throat. It wasn't Rachel. It wasn't even the figure that had been haunting them. The voice came from within him, like an echo of the building itself. The realization hit him like a freight train. The very walls of this place had been alive, waiting, watching. The building had always known they would come, and now it wanted something in return. Without thinking, Aaron turned and ran. The darkness seemed to stretch endlessly in front of him, closing in on him like a ravenous mouth. His pulse pounded in his ears as he sprinted down the hallway, his feet slamming against the floor. But the scraping noise followed him, and the air seemed to shift, becoming thicker with each passing second. No escape. The words echoed again in his mind, and he felt the weight of them pressing down on him, suffocating him. There was no escape, no way out. And then he heard it, a voice. Not his own, not the thing from the shadows. Help! It was a soft, weak cry, almost drowned out by the ever-present hum of dread in the air. But it was unmistakable. Rachel. Aaron's heart leaped into his throat as he turned, desperate to find her. The hallway stretched before him, dark and endless. He stumbled forward, his hands brushing against the walls, the cold, slick surface sending shivers down his spine. But as he rounded the corner, he stopped dead in his tracks. There, in the middle of the hallway, Rachel stood, her back turned toward him. She was completely still, like a statue, her arms hanging limply by her sides. She wasn't moving, not even breathing. "Rachel?" Aaron whispered, his voice hoarse and uncertain. He took a cautious step forward, fear gnawing at him, the oppressive darkness pressing in on him from all sides. No response. He reached out a trembling hand, but as soon as his fingers brushed her shoulder, she turned to face him. Her eyes were empty, hollow, dark. The sight of her face made Aaron's stomach lurch with horror. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and there was something wrong with her mouth. It was stretched unnaturally wide, far too wide, revealing teeth that seemed too sharp, too numerous. Her lips curled into a twisted smile, one that didn't belong to her. "Rachel," Aaron gasped, stepping back in terror. But she didn't speak. Instead, she opened her mouth wider, and the sound that escaped was a guttural, inhuman growl. It was the sound of something hungry. Suddenly, Aaron understood. This was not Rachel. Not anymore. The thing that had taken her, that had taken everything in this building, was standing before him now. And there was no escape. Not for her. Not for him. The walls of the building seemed to close in on him, the space growing tighter and tighter, until he could feel the pressure against his chest. The thing that had once been Rachel reached for him, its fingers elongated and twisted, its face a grotesque mask of hunger. Aaron ran, his feet pounding against the floor, but it was no use. The darkness was everywhere. The walls, the floor, the ceiling. It all closed in on him, until he couldn't breathe, couldn't think. And then, with one final breath, the world went black. The darkness that consumed Aaron felt endless, like a void that had no beginning or end. He couldn't move, couldn't think, just an overwhelming sense of nothingness. His mind drifted in and out of consciousness, and for a moment, he wasn't sure if he was awake or still trapped in a nightmare. But then there was a flicker, a glimmer of light, faint and distant. His heart thudded painfully in his chest as the light grew stronger, like the first ray of dawn breaking through a stormy sky. He could feel something now, a presence, a weight pressing against him, lifting him from the suffocating blackness. He gasped for air, his lungs aching as if they hadn't been used in years. His eyes snapped open, but all he saw was darkness. It wasn't the same suffocating blackness that had held him before, but it was still thick, still heavy. It surrounded him, pressing in on every side. Then a sound, a faint scraping noise. Aaron's heart froze. The memory came rushing back, the thing that had once been Rachel, the eyes that burned with hunger, the twisted smile. He had to get out. He had to find a way out of this nightmare. With great effort, he forced his limbs to move, his body trembling with exhaustion, his head throbbing in pain. He pushed himself up, his hands scraping against the cold, rough surface beneath him. His mind was clouded, his thoughts muddled, but one thing was clear: he was not alone. The scraping sound grew louder, closer, as if something was moving toward him. The air seemed to tighten, growing colder, and Aaron's breath came out in shallow gasps. Panic surged within him, and he tried to move faster, but his limbs felt sluggish, uncooperative. The world around him seemed to spin as he stumbled forward, the noise growing closer with every step. And then, through the thick veil of darkness, he saw it. A figure, cloaked in shadows, moving slowly toward him. It was impossible to make out its features, but Aaron could feel its eyes on him, cold, unblinking, and full of malice. The thing was close now, so close that Aaron could hear its labored breathing, its raspy inhale as it drew closer. He tried to scream, but his throat was dry, his voice a hoarse whisper that barely made a sound. He staggered backward, his heart pounding in his chest, but his body refused to cooperate. Every step he took felt like a struggle, his limbs heavy as though they were filled with lead. The thing's movements were unnaturally slow, almost deliberate, as if it were savoring every moment. It inched closer, its form now partially visible in the dim light. Its features were distorted, its face a blur of shadows and grotesque shapes, but there was no mistaking the malevolent intent in its movements. Aaron could feel it now. Its presence was all-encompassing, suffocating. He was trapped in this dark, twisted world with it, and there was no escape. His pulse quickened, and the terror surged through him like wildfire, burning through every fiber of his being. "It's here." The thought echoed in his mind, but it wasn't his own. It was a whisper, soft, eerie, and it seemed to come from everywhere, from the walls themselves. Aaron turned, trying to find a way out, but the room seemed to stretch endlessly before him, an infinite expanse of darkness and shadow. The figure was closer now, its footsteps slow but certain, as if it knew it had all the time in the world. Desperation clawed at Aaron's chest as he stumbled back, his hands scraping against the walls. The walls, his mind raced, remembering the twisted, hidden spaces behind the drywall. The very structure of this building was alive, an extension of whatever force had trapped them here. In that moment, something clicked. The walls were more than just a physical boundary. They were a prison, a containment vessel. They weren't just hiding spaces for old things. They were hiding the source, the force, the thing that had taken Rachel, that had taken them all. Aaron knew what he had to do. He had to destroy it. With trembling hands, he searched frantically for something, anything, to use as a weapon. His fingers brushed against a jagged piece of debris, something sharp and broken, and he grabbed it, the rough edge cutting into his palm. It didn't matter. Nothing mattered anymore, but ending this nightmare. He turned to face the approaching figure. It was almost upon him now, its shape more defined in the dim light, but it still seemed to shimmer and blur at the edges, as though it couldn't fully exist in the world of the living. The smell that emanated from it was foul, rancid, like decay and rot. It stank of death. The thing's eyes, those glowing, empty eyes, locked onto Aaron, and it stopped moving. The silence was unbearable, thick and suffocating. Aaron's breath caught in his throat as he stepped forward, brandishing the jagged piece of debris in his hand. His heart raced, his mind a blur of terror and resolve. He had no idea if this would work, but it was his only chance. With a guttural snarl, the figure lunged forward, and Aaron swung the makeshift weapon with all his strength, aiming for the thing's center. The impact sent a shock of pain through his arm, but the thing did not falter. Instead, it let out an eerie, otherworldly scream. a sound that seemed to reverberate in his bones like nails on a chalkboard. The figure shuddered, but it didn't fall. It didn't die. Aaron felt his knees buckle beneath him, the weight of hopelessness crashing down on him. His vision blurred as he staggered backward, barely able to stay on his feet. It's too late. The thought settled in his mind like a bitter truth, and it was then that he understood. This place wasn't just cursed. It wasn't just haunted. It was alive, feeding, growing stronger with every soul it consumed. And Aaron, he was no different than all the others who had been trapped here before him. The last thing he saw before everything went black was the glowing eyes of the creature, watching him, knowing that he would never escape. The darkness swallowed Aaron whole. His body was heavy, his mind a mess of incoherent thoughts, but there was no escape, no way to fight anymore, no strength to push against the weight that crushed him. When Aaron finally awoke, he was unsure how much time had passed. It felt like moments, but it could have been days. He opened his eyes, but the darkness was still there, pressing down on him. A cold sweat dripped from his brow, and his limbs ached with an unbearable heaviness. His mouth was dry, his throat raw. But something had changed. The air around him felt different, thick, almost tangible. He could feel a pulse, like the very walls of the building were breathing, exhaling and inhaling with a sinister rhythm. The sound of shuffling feet reached his ears, but this time it wasn't the creature. No, it was something else, something just as terrible. The sound of footsteps, growing louder, closer. It was a chorus now, not just one pair of feet, but many. Aaron tried to move, but his body refused to obey him. His muscles were stiff, uncooperative, and his vision was hazy. His head throbbed painfully, and his chest tightened, as if something was choking him from the inside out. He tried to scream, but no sound came. His mouth opened, but it was as though his vocal cords had been ripped away. The room, if it could even be called that, seemed to close in on him. The walls were no longer just silent and oppressive. They were alive, pulsing, breathing, shifting in and out of his perception, as if the very structure of the apartment building was morphing and changing around him. In the distance, there was a whisper, a low, unintelligible murmur that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It was an unsettling sound, like the distant voices of the lost. Those who had been consumed by the house, their souls trapped within its walls. And Aaron knew with absolute certainty that he was not alone. The whispers grew louder, and Aaron could feel them crawling under his skin, invading his mind. They spoke in broken phrases, fragments of sentences, but none of it made sense. It was all gibberish, a confusing mess of voices trying to tell him something, but he couldn't understand. Suddenly there was a shift in the air, a crackling sound like static from an old radio. The darkness flickered, and Aaron could see a figure standing just outside his range of vision. It was a silhouette, but unlike the creature before, this one seemed more familiar, more human. The figure stepped closer, its movements slow, deliberate, as if it had all the time in the world. Aaron's heart pounded in his chest, his pulse racing as he realized what it was. The shape of a woman, but distorted, twisted. Her features were obscured in shadows, but there was something about her, something familiar. It was Rachel, but it couldn't be. She was gone. She had disappeared, swallowed by the darkness, by the very force that had taken so many others before her. She couldn't be here, not like this. And yet, as she stepped closer, her form became clearer. Her eyes glowed, bright and unnatural, burning with an eerie light that didn't belong to the living. "Help me!" Her voice was a rasp, a whisper that sounded like it was coming from far away. "I'm trapped here. We're all trapped here." Aaron's breath caught in his throat. Was this real? Was it a hallucination? Or was it something far worse? Her body jerked unnaturally, twitching in ways that human bodies shouldn't. She stretched her hand out toward him, but it wasn't a gesture of comfort. It was a plea, a desperate, hollow plea. "Do you hear them?" she continued, her voice cracking. "They never stop. They never leave. We're all part of it now." The air grew colder, and Aaron felt a chill creep into his bones. It wasn't just her. He could feel the presence of the others. They were all around him, their disembodied voices weaving through the dark, a cacophony of whispered words, moans, and cries. The darkness seemed to close in even further, pressing against his chest, his throat. It was suffocating. Rachel's form shifted again, her features blurring and distorting, as if her body was trying to break free from the rules of the physical world. Her eyes became hollow, her skin pale and stretched tight over her bones, like a puppet that had been abandoned and left to rot. "You can't escape," she hissed, her voice no longer human. "None of us can. We're all part of it. We belong to it now." Aaron recoiled, his heart hammering in his chest as her hand reached for him, her fingers elongated and twisted. The shadows in the room seemed to surge, pulsing with a hunger that had never truly been sated. The walls themselves seemed to close in, and he could hear the sound of whispering, pleading voices growing louder, louder still, until it was deafening. He tried to scream, to push away, but his body was paralyzed. His mind screamed for escape, but there was nowhere to run. The walls, the darkness, the thing, they were all part of the same nightmare, and it was all closing in on him. The last thing Aaron saw was Rachel's twisted, tortured smile, the shadows swallowing her figure whole. And then the darkness took him completely. The walls, alive with whispers, with hunger, with pain, grew still once more. And for the first time in what felt like eternity, there was silence. The silence was overwhelming. It was deafening. There were no more whispers, no more cries of the lost. The pulse of the walls had stopped, and for a fleeting moment, Aaron thought maybe, just maybe, it was all over. But even in that brief stillness, he felt the oppressive weight of something watching, something waiting. The world around him was a blur of darkness, a fog that pressed against his senses. He couldn't tell where his body ended and the blackness began. He was floating in an endless void, a place where time seemed to lose all meaning. Was he dead? Had he crossed over into some realm of the lost? The questions raced through his mind, but no answers came. Then in the distance, faintly, Aaron heard it, a soft rustling sound like someone or something moving through the darkness. The sound grew louder, closer. It was a scraping noise like nails dragging along the floor, but there was something rhythmic about it. It was deliberate, methodical. And then a figure emerged from the dark, stepping slowly into view. A silhouette at first, barely distinguishable from the blackness that surrounded it. But as it drew nearer, Aaron's heart stopped. The figure was Rachel, or what had once been Rachel. Her face was no longer a face. It was a mask of pale, stretched skin, hollow eyes that burned with an unnatural light. Her mouth hung open in an eternal scream, though no sound came from it. She moved without any care for the physical limitations of the human form. Her limbs twisted unnaturally, stretching and contorting in ways that defied logic. Every step she took was accompanied by that same scraping noise, like claws dragging along stone. "You're still here," Rachel's voice came again, but it wasn't her voice. It was deeper now, more guttural. The words were slurred, as if they were being forced out of a throat that wasn't made to speak. Aaron could barely respond, his body still trapped in the same paralyzed state as before. His breath came in shallow gasps, his chest tight with the weight of the unseen force pressing against him. "Why?" Rachel's figure loomed closer. "Why did you stay? You should have left when you had the chance. It's too late now. We're all part of it." Aaron's mind raced. Part of what? What was this? What had happened to her? To all of them? The creature, Rachel, continued to approach, its features warping and distorting with every step. The air grew colder, and the darkness pressed in tighter. The pulse of the walls was returning, slow at first, then quicker. The rhythm of it was becoming frantic. Suddenly, the walls around Aaron began to shift. The floor beneath him groaned. The ceiling above him creaked and cracked. It felt as if the entire building was alive, no more than that. It was a beast, a terrible thing that had been fed and nurtured by the fear of those who lived within it. Rachel's form loomed even closer, and then she stopped, just inches from Aaron. The blackness around them seemed to swell, swallowing everything in sight. There was no escaping it. He was trapped, suffocated by it, and as the creature raised its twisted, elongated hand toward him, Aaron felt the weight of hopelessness settle deep in his bones. "You can't escape," the voice whispered again. It was everywhere, in his mind, in his soul. "We're all trapped here." And then, with a sudden rush of sound, the darkness enveloped him. But it wasn't just the darkness. It was the voices. Thousands of them, no longer distant murmurs, but overwhelming, suffocating, drowning him. They were everywhere, inside him, crawling through his thoughts, twisting his mind, as if they were part of him. The walls, the darkness, Rachel, they were all one. He was inside it now. He was part of it. The last thing Aaron saw before the darkness took him completely was the twisted figure of Rachel, her hollow eyes staring at him, her smile stretched too wide, too far. And as her image blurred, the last shred of his consciousness slipping away, he heard the final, horrific words. "Now you're one of us." And then nothing. The silence returned, as the walls once again pulsed with life. The silence was deep and suffocating, but there was no peace in it. Aaron's mind, though clouded and distant, still clung to the faintest thread of awareness. He could feel the air around him, thick and suffused with an oppressive presence. But there was nothing he could grasp, no tangible form to the horror that enveloped him. He floated in the inky void, disembodied and numb. He no longer felt his body, but his thoughts. Those were still there, drifting like fragments of a shattered memory. And then a faint stirring in the darkness, a crackle of static in the quiet, pulled his attention back. The walls. They weren't silent anymore. The low, rhythmic pulse of their life was returning, thrumming beneath the ground, reverberating in the very air he breathed. It was as if they were breathing again, but this time they exhaled with more force, more urgency. It was a hunger, insatiable, gnawing at the air around him. And then the whispers returned. They weren't distant this time. They were right there within him. His own mind was filled with their voices, their twisted murmurs, all speaking in unison, like a chorus of the damned. They called to him, pulled him in, beckoning him to listen, to understand. "You're one of us now," they whispered over and over, their voices a constant, insistent hum. "You can't escape. You never could." Aaron's thoughts flickered, a fleeting image of Rachel's face. No, not Rachel anymore, flashed through his mind. The thing that had been her, that horrible, contorted form, grinning at him in that awful, twisted way. But even that image began to fade, replaced by a new one, something even darker, more terrifying. The walls began to move again, shifting, groaning with a strange life. They were no longer static, no longer solid. The structure of the building itself was warping, folding in on itself. The lines between space and reality began to blur, twisting together like a living thing. Aaron couldn't comprehend it. He couldn't make sense of it. But then he felt something. A weight, a pressure, a tugging sensation deep within his chest. Something was trying to pull him, not just from the darkness, but from himself. He felt his body, or the remnants of it, begin to fade. He couldn't remember what it had felt like to be whole. His hands, his legs, his skin. Everything was dissolving, becoming part of the darkness, part of the walls. He could no longer feel his fingers, his toes, the pulse of his heart. It was as if he had been reduced to nothing more than a fragment of thought, a speck of memory adrift in the infinite void. The whispers grew louder, the voices of the lost, of those who had come before him. They all spoke in one unified cry. They were warning him, begging him to understand. It doesn't end. Aaron wanted to scream, but there was no air left in his lungs. There was no body to scream with. He was just a consciousness, lost in the oppressive, suffocating darkness. But then, through the blackness, a light, a flicker. It was faint, distant, but it burned brighter than anything Aaron had seen in what felt like an eternity. He was pulled toward it, helplessly, his fading form drawn like a moth to the flame. The further he moved toward it, the stronger the pull became, as though something was forcing him toward that tiny speck of light. His mind, his essence, was still intact somewhere. It had to be. The light grew clearer, and with it, the whispers began to fade. The pull of the darkness loosened. Aaron could feel the air around him shift, the oppressive weight lifting ever so slightly. It was like he was breaking free, like he was waking up from a dream, or from some nightmare. He had to get closer, had to find out what this light was. It wasn't a beacon. It was something else. Something that beckoned him with a strange kind of calm, a stillness that was almost welcoming. It was too much to ignore. As he neared, the light expanded, revealing shapes, shadows. For the first time, Aaron could see something more solid in the void. Something familiar. A door. It was there, standing alone in the middle of nothingness. A door that seemed out of place, completely detached from the surreal chaos around him. It was ajar just slightly, and from beyond it, the soft sound of murmuring voices could be heard. These voices were different from the others, gentler, more familiar. The tugging sensation in Aaron's chest grew stronger. It was as though the door was calling to him, pulling him in with a magnetic force. Without thinking, his mind and what was left of his body moved toward the door. He didn't have control of the movement. It was as though his very soul was being drawn through the darkness, unable to resist. The door creaked open slowly, revealing a soft, glowing light spilling through the crack. And in that light, Aaron saw something he had almost forgotten. A face, a familiar face. His wife, Rachel. But she was different. Her face was whole again, unblemished, serene. Her eyes no longer burned with an unnatural light. She was smiling, a smile that was both sad and comforting, as if she had been waiting for him, as if she had never left. "Come to me, Aaron," she whispered, her voice soft and gentle. "It's not too late. We can leave this place together." The darkness seemed to recede with her words, retreating into the corners of his mind. And for the first time since the moment he had stepped into this nightmare, Aaron felt the smallest shred of hope. Rachel's voice pulled him closer, each word wrapping around his consciousness like a soft, comforting blanket. He couldn't resist. The weight of the darkness, the whispers, the oppressive forces that had haunted him for what felt like forever. These things were fading, as if the light of the door was erasing them. But as he stepped closer, something deep within him hesitated. The warmth of her voice felt too good, too comforting, like a lie dressed in the language of salvation. Something wasn't right. He paused at the threshold, staring at Rachel's face, so perfect, so still, as though nothing had ever happened, as though everything had always been okay. But there was something off. Her smile, although gentle, was too perfect, too practiced. Her eyes, while filled with love, seemed hollow, the gleam in them wrong. Empty, perhaps even void of the soul that had once been there. "Come to me," Rachel whispered again, and this time it was more insistent, more demanding. The words seemed to bleed into his mind, as though they were not spoken but transmitted directly to his thoughts. He could feel her presence press against him like a tide pulling at him, urging him to step forward. But Aaron's mind, clouded as it was, began to wrestle with the truth. His memories flashed before him, of their life together, their love, their shared moments, the joy they had once known. But now, like a dream fading in the morning light, those memories felt fractured, incomplete. No, he thought to himself, this isn't Rachel. This can't be her. The air around him thickened again, heavier than before. He could feel the shift, the dark presence at the edges of the light. The door, once inviting, began to feel like a trap, a cage that was slowly closing around him. Rachel, Aaron croaked, his voice trembling. Where am I? What's happening? This isn't real, is it? The smile on her face never faltered. In fact, it seemed to widen, stretching unnaturally. The warmth he had once felt began to turn cold, a chill creeping down his spine. Her eyes, once warm and familiar, now glowed with a malevolent energy, brighter than before, burning with an intensity that made his chest tighten. Her face twisted, and for a brief, fleeting moment, Aaron thought he saw the flicker of something else, something darker, beneath the surface. You're so close, Aaron, she murmured, her voice a soft lull. Just step inside. You've already seen what waits for you out here. You know the truth now. He shook his head, backing away from the door, his feet feeling as though they were dragging through thick mud. The walls of the room, no, the void, seemed to shift, stretching, pulling in every direction. The door had grown larger, more ominous, as if the thing behind it was trying to suck him in. No! Aaron gasped, fighting against the pull. His body was weak, frail from the torment, but his mind clung to the one thing he knew to be true. This wasn't Rachel. The woman in front of him, though she had her voice, her face, her eyes, it was not her. It was something else, something pretending to be her. With a cry of panic, Aaron turned and bolted away from the door. But as soon as he did, the walls began to close in on him. The light from the door flickered and dimmed, and the pulse of the walls, those terrible walls, was louder now, pounding in his head like a drum. Don't leave, the voice called after him, twisted and warped now, no longer Rachel's sweet whispers. You can't escape. You belong to us now. The words grew more frantic, more desperate, echoing inside his skull. His feet stumbled as he ran, the darkness closing in, and the walls seemed to stretch and distort around him, every corner twisting into a nightmarish version of itself. He couldn't breathe, couldn't think. He was drowning in it, in the overwhelming weight of the void. And then, just as suddenly as the darkness had rushed in, it stopped. Aaron found himself standing in the middle of an unfamiliar room, disoriented and dizzy. The walls were normal, real, solid, as if nothing had ever happened. The air was thick with the scent of dust, a musty, stale smell, but it was familiar. The lights flickered above him, and for the first time, in what felt like forever, Aaron thought he might be waking up from some terrible dream. But then, his eyes fell on the wall in front of him. It was there, something he hadn't noticed before, something he hadn't even known to look for. The faintest of marks marred the smooth surface of the wall, as though something had scraped across it, leaving jagged, uneven lines. The scratches weren't random, though. They were deliberate, carefully etched, deep gouges that formed a pattern. Aaron's breath caught in his throat as he stepped closer, drawn to the markings. He ran his fingers over them, and they were cold to the touch. His mind began to race, the fog lifting slightly as a realization slowly dawned on him. The marks weren't just scratches. They were words. The symbols were a language, one that had been carved into the wall long ago. And as Aaron traced them with his fingers, a chill ran through his spine, for the message was clear, written in a hand he knew all too well. You can never leave." The words were a warning, an inescapable truth. Aaron stepped back, his heart pounding in his chest. His mind reeled, the world around him spinning as the true horror of the situation set in. He was never going to leave. Not this place. Not the house. Not the nightmare that had followed him, that had fed on his fear. The walls weren't just part of the building. They were the thing that had been alive all along. And they were waiting. Aaron's heart raced as the weight of the words settled over him, heavy and suffocating. The walls seemed to hum with a quiet, persistent energy, like the pulse of something ancient and malevolent. He could almost hear it, just beneath the surface, a low, guttural sound that vibrated in the very marrow of his bones. It was as though the house itself was alive, breathing, waiting for something or someone. Waiting for him. He turned away from the wall, but the room felt smaller now, suffocating. The air was thick with a sense of confinement, as though the very space around him had shrunk by a few inches. Every movement seemed to echo, every creak of the floorboards, every shift of the house, magnifying the sensation of being trapped. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't think. He could only feel the walls closing in on him, pushing him into a corner. He staggered to the door, his hands trembling as he tried to turn the handle. It was stuck. No matter how hard he pulled, it refused to budge. Panic surged through him as he pressed his shoulder against the door, trying to force it open. It didn't move. He wasn't going anywhere. Not unless the house allowed it. Frantically, Aaron turned, his mind spiraling, desperate for a way out, for some kind of explanation. His eyes darted around the room, but nothing seemed to offer any answers. The space around him felt alien, as if it had shifted while he wasn't looking. He could swear the walls had closed in on him even further, the once spacious room now suffocatingly narrow. And then, from the corner of the room, there came a sound, a soft scuttling noise. Almost imperceptible, like the movement of something small, something hidden, moving just out of sight. Aaron froze. His breath caught in his throat, his blood running cold. The scuttling grew louder, more distinct, as if something or someone was crawling closer. He glanced toward the corner where the sound had originated. The shadows there seemed to writhe, shifting unnaturally. For a moment, he wondered if his mind was playing tricks on him, if the fear had finally twisted reality itself into something nightmarish. But then the shadows took shape. A hand, long, slender fingers covered in dark, wet-looking skin, reached out from the darkness. It moved with an unsettling, jerky motion, as though it wasn't meant to move at all. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, it disappeared again, retreating into the darkness from which it had emerged. Aaron's pulse quickened, his body going cold as ice. He couldn't move. He could only stand there, rooted to the spot, as a dreadful realization began to creep over him. The house was alive, yes, but it wasn't just the house that was watching him. Something else was here, something inhuman, something that had been waiting for him. The floor creaked beneath him as he shifted, a muffled thud echoing in the silence. His foot brushed against something cold and damp. He looked down, his breath hitching when he saw it. A trail of dark, viscous liquid that seemed to seep from the cracks in the floorboards. It snaked its way across the room, disappearing into the walls, as if it were being drawn towards something, or someone. With trembling hands, Aaron stepped back, his heart hammering in his chest. The walls were no longer just marks of the past. They were alive with something that he couldn't see, but could feel, creeping beneath his skin. The room felt hotter, the air thickening with a palpable presence. He could almost taste it on his tongue, the fear, the tension. It was suffocating, and he was trapped. There was no escape. The scuttling sound grew louder again, and this time, Aaron didn't wait. He bolted, turning back toward the door and throwing his shoulder into it once more. It resisted at first, but with a final desperate shove, the door gave way, creaking open. He spilled into the hallway, gasping for breath, his eyes darting around in panic. The apartment was still dark, the faint light from the windows doing little to alleviate the oppressive atmosphere. He couldn't explain it. Everything about this place felt wrong, as if it were alive and had been waiting for him all along. A flicker of movement caught his eye. A shadow, quick and fleeting, disappearing around the corner. He wasn't alone. The thing in the walls, whatever it was watching him, waiting for him to make a mistake. The thought of Rachel, of her smile, of the warmth she had offered him, flashed through his mind. Was she in danger? Had she already fallen victim to whatever had been lurking here all along? Was it too late to save her? His chest tightened as guilt gnawed at him. What if she had been trying to warn him all along? What if somehow this had been her fate too? Panic surged through him again. He had to find her. He had to get out of here. But every step he took seemed to pull him deeper into the nightmare. The walls weren't just barriers. They were alive, and every footstep, every breath, every movement was feeding it. Whatever it was that had been hiding in the shadows had tasted his fear, and now it was hunting him. And as Aaron turned down another dark hallway, he realized with horrifying clarity that the house wasn't just trying to trap him. It was consuming him. The thing in the walls was alive, and it had made him its prey.